Basically, I'm a retired Wyoming game and fish biologist. I work for the non-game program and managed the wild swan program from 1999 until 2018 when I retired. And I also co-chaired or chaired the Greater Yellowstone Trumpeter Swan group for about 2 centuries. It felt it was about 12 or 15 years. And that group is still going strong, I'm glad to report. So today I'll be talking about our long-term program, phases of range expansion of trumpeter swans in the Green River. And the trumpeter swan is a designated state species of conservation concern in Wyoming, and that's based on its small population size and restricted distribution. I was responsible for this program along with other high priority species at risk. And it's interesting, you know, the swan is one of those species that falls between management categories in some states because it's waterfowl, but our waterfowl biologists are all used to managing hunted species. So in Wyoming, at least for a while, the non-game program took off. But last year, I actually emerged from retirement. I got a small grant to investigate what was happening in the Green River expansion population, which Dave alluded to in his talk. There has been, after a peak, a population decline after 10 years of strong growth. So, but today I wanted to summarize the history of our program, since there's young people here who didn't realize this. I've given a lot of talks in the past at Trumpeter Swan Society, but then examine some of the demographic changes. So this is dedicated to Dave Lockman. He was an early and committed champion of trumpeter swans in Wyoming and the Pacific Flyway, and I think Bill will agree with me. He inspired many people. He used to come to the local bird club once a month, and that's when I met him in the late 80s, just raving about swans. So he was incredibly passionate about that. And the work I'll discuss today probably never would have taken place without him starting it all. But first, I want to reemphasize why we need management of swans in this area. And a lot of other speakers have noted this, so it may be a bit redundant, but there were only 2 populations of swans known in the 1920s. And many people thought, biologists thought it was a species that was basically extinct. And so Alberta and Wyoming, and it turned out all those birds came down to winter in not just Wyoming, but the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and Red Rock Lakes and the whole history of that. A lot of you know, but it's also been mentioned that swans, the fur traders wiped out swans along with commercial hunters. But other part of the story is they took out the beaver. They took out our native wetland engineer. And it's taken me years to realize this, but the Green River country was one of the highest sources of beavers. And if you'd go there today, you would not believe that. I think these landscapes have been altered in ways we are just beginning to understand. So as the nesting population in Canada started to grow, they still, you know, there was little in Alberta, but in the 70s, it started to expand and grow more and more. And they all still just zeroed in and came down to a very small area to winter in the greater Yellowstone, the core area. And you know, it's kind of hard to imagine why one of the largest waterfowl in the world would winter in one of the harshest areas of this country. And this is the map from Banco, and it's quite incredible to think that this area is like 100 miles across both directions. And until fairly recently, all our resident swans and all the migrating swans were in that area. And there's all these expansion programs you've heard about. You know, there's been tremendous work done to get the birds spread out from that small place. So I think we need to appreciate the people who come before us. So why did that affect Wyoming? Most of the birds were wintering along the Henry's Fork to the west of here in Idaho. But you can see here, if you look back in 1983, when Dave started swan work, we only had about 100 resident swans in the state, but the winter population was almost 3 times that. And as you can see, it greatly expanded. And this is a very small area in Wyoming and Yellowstone National Park where these birds are coming. So the phase 1 of expansion, when Dave started as a Pacific Flyway Western Wyoming waterfowl biologist, was he worked on looking at the swans that were here, tagged over 50% of them. He was a great field person, but also he was really into management planning and conservation. And he worked and was one of the major authors on the first Pacific Flyway Management Plan and a range expansion plan. And one of the ideas was to expand the population, but in ways that it remained connected and didn't get disconnected like some of the early movements had done. So in Wyoming, both looking at the landscape and then doing a lot of wetland work, see all the swans, the core area were here in Jackson, along the Snake River and lots of spring creeks in the winter, and also up in Yellowstone. This is Red Rock Lakes. So what Dave did is identify the Salt River as a potential wintering area, and then the Green River, which is to the east and then goes down and eventually connects with the Colorado. But one of the things about the Green as a breeding area, there was only one pair of birds that maybe was hanging out here, no swans in this whole area, but Fontenelle Reservoir, which was, the dam was built in 1964, provided open water for about 20 to 30 miles below the dam. And a lot of waterfowl were wintering there, but no swans. So Dave was actually, his position was eliminated, kicked upstairs, maybe in part because of his love of the great white duck, I'm not sure. But non-game program took over swan management. And so there was a habitat assessment done in the Green River, and then translocations began. And Cody mentioned a bit of this in his talk yesterday, but at first in 92 and 93, these were translocations of wild birds, mainly from Red Rock Lakes and to the Pinedale area and to Siskiyou National Wildlife Refuge. Now, most of those birds did not stick. They were gone. And so that's when Wyoming Game and Fish began working with Bill Long to release captive race swans in Pinedale area. And this breaks down the releases by year. I thought some of you might be interested. It shows the number of cygnets, yearlings. And so the ones in 92 were all the wild birds, and the rest were different ages, including some grafted birds. And of course, like many of you talked, you want to know what your birds are doing. And so we tried different marking techniques. It's really hard in Wyoming, very remote, roadless areas, hard to recite birds. So I thought that once we got into VHF and even satellite, that would be the answer. But I want to discuss this briefly because we had 6 collars out, and I flew January 2003. It's the only time I almost got air sick on a flight. Every collar was on mortality. And I spent a lot of time the next, into the summer recovering all those collars. And there had been a big, what we called an Arctic storm. So temperatures had dropped -30, -40, and there were 40-mile-an-hour winds during that storm. And 2 of the 6 birds survived, excuse me, survived because I had experimented with lightweight collars that were plastic, and they actually were able to break off. But most of the other collars we found were intact. So the birds obviously had died. They weren't attached anymore. So I would love to talk to people, especially from Northern Europe or other places. We're putting out a lot of collars now. If anyone's seen those kind of mortality events or not, or if it was just the special conditions in Pinedale. Frankly, we haven't seen storms like that the last few years, so maybe it's a thing of the past, but when they happened, it was pretty brutal. So we didn't have enough resighting data to do survivorship, but we were able to identify some sources of mortality for this population. And collisions really are throughout Wyoming in our extended database, one of the big problems. But the thing is, birds that die of disease, we don't pick up. And no one's talked about avian influenza, but again, that's something I'm curious about if it's happening on the landscape. So for phase 2, we kind of ended in 2003, and you can see that we started to get production of cygnets, and they were producing more than we were able to put out. So at that point, stepped back from reintroductions. But before I go to phase 3, I wanted to say Seatskiddy is such a special place. And really this reintroduction program was probably so successful as it was because one of the few wild swans that stayed in the area was a female adult, unknown age, from Red Rock Lakes, but she was a leucistic bird. She had yellow legs rather than black. And she was the first one to nest at Seatskiddy and produced an average of, over her time, of 4 cygnets per year. She fledged a total of 35. And overall, Seatskiddy through 2006 to 2021 has fledged almost 50% of all the cygnets produced in the Green River. I'll get into more demographics later, but one of the things about Seatskiddy, it's managed wetlands. They were drained every winter. They were very productive. And they also were right next to the river, which was the wintering habitat. So the swans were very close to where they nested. So it's pretty ideal. So the third phase of the work was to do wetland habitat work. And I was inspired to do this because swans were producing and we had used some of the best wetlands to put them out on, and these were mainly private lands. So we started to work with landowners because we have a lot of irrigation water and a lot of big ranches in the area. And the state wildlife grant program started 2003, and one of the first things we funded was Dave Lockman, who had just retired. We got him out on the landscape again, and he wrote a very detailed plan and worked with 13 different ranches and developed plans for 22 projects. And we wrote together prescriptions for creating wetland habitat, able to support swans based on how much they eat and how much aquatic vegetation they need. And so if anyone wants that, I can, email that in the future. It's nice to have project plans. I tell you, anyone who works with wetlands know that it's very complex to get projects going. Landowners change, budgets change, on and on. But we were able in 7 years to get funding to complete projects on 5 ranches and created over 60 acres of habitat. One of my favorite projects, this was a reservoir that swans always tried to nest on and failed when they nested on the shore. We built a small island. It was about 6 by 8 feet, maybe a little larger. And boy, they have used it ever since. They've been very productive. So a simple project, but one that really worked. And this is just showing, this is the town of Pinedale, and here's the Green River down to Fontenelle Reservoir where the dam Seatskiddy is here. And these were some of our project ponds in the area. So right in the heart of where the swans had began nesting. And, we got a lot of money. It was rich times, and, and management times change, but Wyoming had started a wildlife trust for habitat projects we were able to tap into. BLM started a project with all the energy development going on in the area. They wanted to fund conservation. So it's just the alphabet soup of different agencies we were able to get funding for. And we also worked with the Nature Conservancy to do an EPA grant to do the first wetland assessment in Wyoming. And that is also available, I'm sure, on the website for Nature Conservancy or EPA. So it's a resource that might be useful. And one of my favorite, we actually did get a standard NACA grant, which worked with the Conservation Fund, and we're able to not only build beautiful wetland, but to do some restoration of cottonwood along the Seaskiddy National Wildlife Refuge. So overall, this is an older slide, but it basically shows the expansion area went all the way down to Green River, where swans were now nesting. And there were no swans nesting before, and also no swans wintering. So where we are now. The green is Green River, and this is our core Snake River population. So first of all, if you go out to 21, you see that the swans are kind of not doing so well in the Snake River. Numbers are down. But the Green River, these were exciting years. Every time I did a flight, there were more swans every year in the fall. And so this was 2016. We peaked at 149. I figured there would be some peak up there where we have limited habitat, but this continued downward. Maybe have slowed a little bit, but we're kind of back to where we were in 2010 in terms of number of adult and subadult birds. So I broke this down, and what I did to come back, I actually did a flight last year because I wanted to make sure that the pilot was actually getting to all the sites that we used to do, and he's doing a good job. This is a year I retired, so I think that might be a retirement effect there, but it didn't totally recover. So, and this shows the number of nesting pairs, which had been increasing, but dropped maybe, but is still about the same as it was at the peak. Broods hatched, numbers have dropped, and cygnet fledged has dropped quite a bit too. But overall, from 2004 to 2021, the Green River swans hatched 615 cygnets from 45 different nest sites, and they fledged 500 birds. So it seems robust. I don't think, we're saying that this population is going to go away, but it's certainly uncertain what is going to look like in the future. And those 45 different nest sites, I'm going to do some more analysis, but some of those were just sites used 1 year and then not used again. But those were sites where at least one cygnet had been produced. So what I did for this analysis for this past year was I grouped the peak years of increase, 2012 to 2016, and compared that to the years of decrease. And as that other slide showed, we have the same number of nesting pairs. So this decrease in number of white birds in the fall is a non-breeding segment. Broods hatched, you see, is down. Fledged is down over 25%. Number of cygnets hatched. All of these decreases suggest there's been a loss of productivity in the system, it seems. But we don't know, it's speculation. So my final thoughts and conclusions. So the declining number of non-breeders, is it immigration? And all this tagging work has been really intriguing. Are we losing birds to Canada? And there's a good chance we are, because the big crunch time in Wyoming is early spring. And the last few years have been horrible in early spring. We've had snow on the ground, snowstorms in early June in Jackson. And some of those wetlands are just not opening up in time for the swans to get into condition and eat and nest. So the non-breeders, you think we have all these Canadian swans here. They all go north in March. They've eaten the heck out of all the wetlands in the area. And our native birds have to sit around and hope the vegetation starts greening up. And the breeders are, of course, guarding the territories, so the young birds don't have places to go. So do they go north with their buddies, maybe? But there is declining productivity. Is this the result of climate change, long-term drought, and erratic spring conditions? Something's going on. Rapid overturn in ranch ownership. When I came back, I was hoping to work with all the ranch owners and get on the property and look at wetlands. And some of the places that we had built, different wetlands on, I couldn't even get access to. It was a new owner and they weren't interested. And so how we're losing their focus. And ponds in Wyoming, like elsewhere, a lot of them are used for fishing or boating, or, it's the landowners who are really interested in swans and will keep them for swans. So important. And my position was not filled. We don't have a non-game or any state position that is really focused on not just the population of swans, but what's happening on the ground. There was a lifting of the ban on snow goose hunting since 2017. There's no data on that. Has it had an effect? Mortalities are hard to pick up, but just displacement maybe out of key habitats, or people shooting at white birds from a distance. Declining budget for federal National Wildlife Refuge is huge, and potential work on the Fontenelle Reservoir and Dam, anything that affects seed skitty, both in breeding and in winter. If that got dewatered in the winter and it happens slowly over time, we could have a catastrophic loss of birds, because if they've settled in for the winter and then there's no habitat, there's not much to eat, in that area. Once it freezes up, that's the only one. And that's the whole nesting population likely winters there. So there are challenges. It's been a long ride. It's been interesting. And hopefully, we'll be able to get some answers and keep this population going.